Hey everybody, today we talk with Peter Tkatchenko. We discuss his views on the Marxian-structuralist perspective, the different educational systems of the US and the UK. We discuss decommercialized Durham, which he co-founded, and we talk about questions such as, does being an extrovert help with activism? How would you change economic education? How should higher education be structured? And on top of that, we talk about the ethical ideas in economics that have underlying value judgments that you never learned even existed or were there. We hope you enjoyed this episode and see a different perspective that you might not have encountered yet. Hey Peter, it's so great to have you here. What have you been up to?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So far over the course of the quarantine that we started off with quarantine, everybody was super enthusiastic about having all this time alone. So I started off studying, full throttle. I was reading quite a bit of political theory, quite a bit of philosophy, trying to branch out in economics. But I've slowed down since a little bit, trying to not burn myself out, trying to, save some fuel in the tank for the school year. But overall, yeah, just sort of trying to make the best of the situation.
So what do you mean branch out? What new kind of topics have you explored?
Yeah, so I've been trying to sort of pick up on more primary texts over the course of the past 6 months. So I'm looking at, I've been revisiting Karl Marx's Capital, been trying to relook at that from a different perspective. I'm preparing to look at, some Keynes. Overall, just trying to gain a perspective on sort of primary material that we otherwise wouldn't be going through over the course of the academic year. Because a lot of what we do is obviously filtered through so many different people. It's pretty refreshing, even though it's even more difficult to sort of, go to the text that sort of started it all,
Okay, so what do you mean it's filtered through different people?
Well, it's sort of, take, for example, Karl Marx, right? So he took a very specific perspective on his work that was very unique to himself. He had very thorough sort of philosophical grounding for everything that he said. And nothing can really substitute the works that he himself wrote. So if you read even just the first volume of his Capital, it's sort of the best introduction to Marxian economics that you could possibly get, despite there being so many other, various interpretations of it. So I generally think that, you should base an economics education or even education, any field in that matter, on primary text at some point. Obviously, it depends on accessibility. Some people, most people probably can't just pick up the primary text from the get-go, but eventually I think it's a good thing to sort of get into the words that the people wrote themselves. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do at the moment.
Interesting. So you feel like that was missing in your bachelor then?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a difficult approach or sort of a difficult strategy to take, because on the one hand, when you're approaching a bachelor's education, you want the student accessible, and it has to be something that is able to be absorbed by the person who's never possibly taken that subject before. So I think that it's really important for an undergraduate to look at primary texts, but at the same time, obviously, it's necessary to not have primary text, to have simplified variants and, introductions to things. And I think to some degree, economics education might be lacking a sort of a grasp on primary text. I feel like politics and philosophy sort of puts more pressure on us to do reading of primary text, and economics sort of lacks in that. But yeah, I'm trying to make up for it.
So you do a very broad bachelor then. If you have politics and philosophy and economics, why did you choose such a broad bachelor?
Yeah, so my interest really started out in philosophy, to be honest. When I was in high school, I read quite a bit of philosophy on my own. We didn't have philosophy education in my school, but it was something that I was really interested in. Interestingly enough, I came across the topics listening to different music. A lot of different musicians. It sounds abnormal, but a lot of musicians, especially in sort of more niche genres, they touch on a lot of philosophical topics in their music. So I sort of introduced myself to philosophy that way, and eventually I expanded to politics and to economics. And I sort of grew to really enjoy all three subjects when I was in high school, and I couldn't really imagine specializing in either one when I got to undergraduate level. I felt like they were so intertwined to an extent where I wouldn't be able to really crucial connections that I otherwise wouldn't be getting in any other bachelor's degree. So that's why I sort of decided to focus on philosophy, politics, and economics. Obviously, I'm specializing more and more, but I think having that sort of basis in philosophy and politics is so important.
So, where did you go to study economics and why there?
Yeah, so I'm currently doing my bachelor's at the University of Durham. One of the reasons why I decided to go there is just because of the overall strength of the program. If you look at all three departments that you're studying, and they just have such breadth of expertise, especially in philosophy and in economics and really in politics. I feel like I wouldn't disparage one department over the other. It's just a university that has leading faculties in all three subjects. And for me, it was really important to get a balanced education in that way. I didn't want to, in my bachelor's, I didn't want to sort of give up one subject for the other. I wanted to have sort of a basis in all three. And I feel like Durham does that really well, especially in philosophy. I've really loved the philosophy lectures. I've loved the economics lectures. A lot of our economics professors have real world experience. I mean, my lecturer for macroeconomics used to work for the Italian Central Bank. My lecturer for statistics used to actually work in industry as a statistician. So those things are so important when you're sort of doing a subject that is so pragmatic and applicable to the real world. So that's something that I really appreciate.
Cool. So would you want to work in one of their jobs, or are you more into academics?
Well, I feel like in an ideal world, I would probably want to spend all of my time just thinking and writing and developing theory and such. But at the same time, I'm so drawn to practical applications. Like I do a lot of sort of social work in terms of volunteering and in terms of activism. And I feel like even though as much as I would enjoy academic work, I also would really, really enjoy doing different types of work, even in the private sector, but also just in NGOs and things like that. Working for the UN would probably be a dream position for me, because I care so much about sort of development and all these things that are grounded in reality and not just sort of theoretical musings. So I would say that I haven't permanently decided yet, but I would be open to pretty much anything, really. I think all those sort of, all of those facets are incredibly important for society. We need to have like a very rigorous academic sphere, but at the same time, you need to be really developing the pragmatic applications of whatever you're, producing.
Okay, so what kind of activism do you do?
So right now I am working with this new society that I helped co-found. It's called Decommercializing Durham. It's something that came about a couple months ago, well, even more than a couple months ago. The university that I'm at, Durham University, was planning a very major restructuring program in light of the coronavirus pandemic. And we were very concerned about the potential impacts that could have on just employment in the university, on the student experience, and just whatever precedent that could potentially set for education in the future. So we started this small group at first. We, wrote up a petition demanding that the university sort of halt any sort of negative restructuring, and it got very broad support over the student body, and to the point where it was, reported on by national news, and we did eventually end up achieving our goal. And I just feel like that sort of work is so important. I feel like a lot of people who see these problems happening are sort of discouraged by the fact that nobody else seems to be doing anything about it, and that's why nobody really sort of steps up to the plate to prevent these negative things from happening. So I think what we did was, first of all, beneficial to the university, but also encouraging to other students. And generally, it aligns with my belief that education should be something that should be safeguarded from commercialization, just broadly speaking. That's one of the normative perspectives that I tend to take. I feel like free marketization and commercialization are beneficial in some spheres and then just not as much in others. And higher education is one of those things that as an institution has existed for such a long time in history and the way it is, and it's been so successful. And I feel like even though, you know, modernity and, you know, the technology that we have benefits us in many ways, applying it to education could undermine it in a lot of other aspects. So I feel like that's one thing that our organization is working towards. But yeah, also just throughout school, I did a lot of teaching and tutoring, and I feel like just having any sort of occupation where you're connecting with people is incredibly important, not just sort of sitting in isolation, developing whatever ideas you have, you know.
That makes sense. So were you always the kind of person who would step up and take action, or where does that come from for you?
Yeah, I would say that I'm just by nature a bit more of an extroverted person, so I tend to put myself out there, whether somebody asks for it or not. But you know, lately, obviously, as I've matured, I've tried to direct my energy towards things that people actually find beneficial. But yeah, I feel like it's something that I really enjoy doing is sort of being in leadership positions, especially when it comes to anything that affects the real lives of people. I mean, when it comes to the commercialization of higher education, it has caused so many problems for so many different people. It's led to exorbitant tuition rates for students. It's led to exploitative conditions for people working in higher education, even just academics. And it's just overall led to a sort of degradation in the institution in itself and also in the quality of life for everybody involved. And so I feel like by sort of taking this position that I've held for so long and actually putting myself out there and organizing people, it's something that I can actually point to and say I've made some sort of change in the way people are living their lives, which I think is really important. Yeah, I think a lot of people generally agree with the position that I'm taking, but they, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily afraid, they're just hesitant because people don't really put themselves out as much. And yeah, I hope that what we're doing is acting as an impetus for anybody else who agrees.
So how would you change education for the better then? If it's now commercializing so much, what would you change?
Yeah, well, talking from a broad perspective, I take the general political position that higher education should be available to everybody and anybody with the ability to do so. I generally think that higher education, just like secondary and primary education, is a public good, or should be if it's not. And in that case, anything that sort of impedes that sort of progress is, in my opinion, negative. Even take just the United States, the fact that even public universities have tuition rates that are matching those of, you know, private institutions at the rates of, you know, $70,000 to $75,000 a year. I think that's absolutely absurd. I think it's preventing a lot of people, a lot of talented individuals who would be productive members of society, who would be leaders in society, from getting the education that they need. But that's just talking from a broad perspective. I think any sort of, again, any sort of economy that we end up constructing needs to provide those sorts of things. Like I said previously, the economy is a man-made institution. It's not some sort of just substratum or some sort of superstructure that exists without our doing, and, you know, we have to follow every dogmatic bidding that it provides to us. I think it's something that we should sort of orient towards the normative decisions that we make, what we believe we should see in a society, and economics education is one of those things, not just economics education, higher education. But that's talking from a broader perspective. More closely, I think that education needs to, I'm generally a very progressive person, but I think higher education needs to return to a structure that it had previously, where individuals who taught in higher education, did research, need to have very stable long-term positions, what we're seeing right now in higher education is that a lot of individuals, a lot of highly educated, highly qualified individuals are having to depend on these sort of short-term, very loose-fitting contracts, sometimes as low as 9 months. And I think that's absolutely absurd to have in higher education, especially if you're somebody who does research. It's so incredibly important to be able to have a dependable position in higher education. Sometimes projects in, research projects that academics do last for decades. So to have to jump from one contract to another, from university to university every 9 months, I think is so destructive to sort of the educational sphere. And obviously it leads to just a sort of degradation of the quality of education. If you have somebody who's working in a university for the long term, they're able to build connections with the staff, build connections with the students. They're able to do better work. They're able to teach better. The programs at the universities don't have to be metamorphosizing every 9 months to sort of fit whatever speciality the next person has. So I think it just leads to a more stable environment. But also, I think it substitutes sort of this forced outreach to international students and to sort of the highest bidder, to providing education at a lower cost to people, locally who really need it. What we're seeing right now at Durham is that they are leading the university to a space where it's able to sort of reach out and appeal to very wealthy individuals internationally, but the cost is that a lot of people in the UK aren't able to afford an education. So I think that is something that is very destructive and shouldn't really be encouraged in higher education in general.
Interesting. So coming from, because you were born and raised in the US, or born and raised or raised in the US,
Born and
and
raised,
then
yes.
yeah, and then you went to the UK. How did these two ways of university differ, and why did you choose to go to the UK?
Yeah, so to be completely honest, my primary reason for going to the UK was just the savings and the cost that I would be experiencing. I mean, even as an international student, I'm going to be paying a third of what I would really be paying per year in the United States. So at this point, it doesn't really seem like a logical investment to be educating myself in the United States when I could be doing so in the UK and not sort of burdening myself with a life's worth of debt. I think that the way that education in the United States is going, it's a very terrifying trajectory. And I feel like politicians are not giving it the attention that it needs. It's something that could be so incredibly destructive to our society in the long term. I mean, if you think about it, every single person essentially who gets a higher education in the United States is going to be leaving university with debt. Almost nobody in the United States has enough financial sort of backing to get a degree and then not leave the university with that type of burden. So you're essentially having multiple generations of workers entering the labor force who right from the bat don't have the ability to provide for themselves, like a home or start a family or even go into further education or even just have a stable emotional state. I mean, can you imagine being a young person? You're just entering, the labor market, and you already have $200,000 in debt. It's absolutely absurd. You have 2 or 3 generations of people who can't have a solid footing in the world because of it. And I generally don't see how the country can continue existing on that sort of basis. It's really anybody who at least doesn't acknowledge that it's a problem is, in my opinion, very short-sighted. Maybe you don't agree that public education should be a public good or higher education should be a public good, but you should at least recognize that it's any sort of debt on that scale is incredibly destructive. But yeah, that's that's sort of a very complex answer to my actions. Yeah.
So how was it moving to the UK then? How was that different culturally, or did you have to adjust?
I would say that the biggest adjustment was just sort of linguistically. Obviously, there were linguistic differences between the US and the UK. Not anything that was sort of uprooting, but definitely led to some awkward moments. But other than that, apart from that, not really anything that major. I would say that the culture varies quite a bit, and the way that different institutions are sort of constructed. Obviously, the educational system in the U.S. is totally different from the U.K. So sort of getting used to that was interesting. Overall, it just gave me a different sort of perspective on the way that education could be conducted. And I think the United States could learn a lot from the UK with the way that they structure their schools. I just remember going throughout my education in the US and remembering how overburdened and stressed out the students in the United States are, and then seeing the students in the UK, they seem to be a bit more healthy in psychological terms, in my opinion. I think that the United States, in terms of their education for young people, tends to put a very big emphasis on rate of output and just massive repetition and memorization, and has a general lack of critical thinking in its education. And I think that the UK, interestingly enough, by providing its students with more leniency in sort of workload, allows for their students to think critically on their own. I think young people who are academically engaged tend to do those things by themselves when they're not sort of burdened with all of the stressors that come with American education. I was sort of shocked to find out that students in the UK can get into top universities without having just exorbitant amounts of extracurricular activities, for example. A lot of people who got into Oxford and Cambridge, they just had really good grades, and they're very much interested in the topic that they're planning on studying. They've read different books and had discussions and written papers and done research. And I think that just having sort of academic rigor on your sort of transcript and showing that you're interested and proficient in some sort of topic should be enough to get into university. I think that in the United States, they put a emphasis that's far too large on just doing sort of busy work. So you're expected to have 5 different leadership positions. You're expected to do formalized activities. So you have to be, registered in you have to be registered in a club if you want to actually put something on your CV. You can't just be interested in politics, and you can't just be like, enthusiastic about reading political theory. You have to be a leader of a club or something, or else it's not really factored into the admissions process. And I feel like that undermines a lot of students who otherwise can't find formalized opportunities for things that they're interested in. I feel like you should be able to get into Harvard University, even if you weren't some sort of, international level, debater or rock climber or whatever. I think that a lot of geniuses out in the world spend a lot of their time reading and writing, and not necessarily just filling their CVs with positions. So that's one thing that I really liked about the UK, and one thing that I'd like to see transferred to the US potentially.
Why do you think that is? Why do you have to have a position in a certain group or organization for these schools?
I think that it's a large part of American culture in general. I think that, well, I'm going to put it very bluntly, sort of the ideological hegemony that sort of has grasped the US for the past few decades has tried to reshape even our private lives in economical terms. So people these days in the US, they go into higher education for the most part to, eventually just get jobs. And so any sort of education that they're going to be getting is going to be have a corporate structure or whatever. And then naturally that just goes down the logical line, and you end up getting a situation where when you're applying to university, your CV has to be full of different positions and different projects that you've done and all of these things, so that you can prove to the admissions people that you are going to be a good fit for that sort of education, and then eventually that sort of labor market. I think that the US has sort of, I wouldn't even say shy away, because I hesitate to say that it ever was the way that I want it to be, but the US has never really been sort of, I feel like, oriented towards a humanitarian perspective on education. I feel like education should be something that's oriented towards the expansion of your intellect and the expansion of your interests. And then eventually, I think as a byproduct, you will have the skills needed to go into the labor market. I don't think it should be the primary focus. And I feel like if you were to have that sort of paradigm shift in the culture of education, the culture of work, then you would see universities prioritize students who maybe don't have as many accolades or leadership positions, but they could tell you all of their opinions and, you know, all of their sort of thoughts on various philosophy and things like that. I think those are the types of people who are being sort of left in the dust in the US. Yeah.
Interesting. So did you find that in the UK that was better, or is there something that you would like to see in the UK that you maybe saw in the US or somewhere else?
I feel like the UK does much better with just this general sort of topic. When I was interviewing in Oxford, I met so many people who were so incredibly passionate about their topics. And, you know, naturally as an American, I asked them, so what does your CV look like? How many leadership positions did you have? How many extracurriculars did you have? Did you do any competitions for this subject? And most of them said, no, not really. Most of them honestly just came home from school, did their homework, and then spent, I don't know, 3 hours every day reading political theory if they were really into politics, or doing math, or, you know, reading books about mathematics if they were into mathematics. If they were into sports, they just played sports. And honestly, the UK just lets young people be young people. It lets young people pursue what they want to pursue. And in that, I think the genius in people sort of starts to come out. And what allows them, you know, even just the regular person to pursue an education in the top institutions. I think the UK does a lot better with that, and it's something that I'd like to see more in the US. I feel like the US underperforms when it comes to that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay. So, okay, a little bit of a shift. So you joined, or you co-founded Decommercializing Durham, but you also joined Durham Society for Economic Pluralism. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So DCEP, or Durham Society for Economic Pluralism, has been around for a few years now. It's part of the overarching network of societies that contribute to rethinking economics. And so as a society, we really do multiple things. We generally invite speakers in economics and just social sciences in general to talk about both heterodox and mainstream approaches to social sciences and economics. We sort of promote fringe, and not even just fringe, but we do try to promote fringe thinking in the subjects because I personally think that it is incredibly beneficial, but also we try to sort of promote different perspectives even on mainstream approaches. So try to revitalize the mainstream approaches in a subject, show how they might still be viable in today's world, even though they were invented, I don't know, 200 years ago or something. So yeah, it's sort of just trying to take a fresh look on things, bringing in new ideas, sort of revitalizing the old ones. We do a lot of work in those terms, in terms of setting up lectures. We do work within our own society where we discuss different topics. We've even had educational outreach programs where we've sent people to various schools who, you know, teach economics to high school students, and sort of try to bolster interest in the subject by showing them that, you know, the topic goes beyond whatever they might be reading in their A-level economics textbook. Because I personally know that, you know, when I was in high school, my interest in economics probably would have just absolutely shot up if I had known that feminist economics existed, and, you know, Marxian economics existed, and, you know, ecological economics, and all these things that I didn't really know about, all these different approaches. You know, and just speaking from that perspective, we sort of try to promote that. We also do a yearly review of our economics program, or at least we're trying to do that. We're trying to sort of analyze the deficiencies in our economics program, sort of do yearly reports, try to work with the administration to bring just a general well-rounded economics education to students. We've sort of pinpointed various areas where economics education has been deficient, at least in our university, in our opinion, and we've been trying to do that in terms of providing, for example, more historical background to whatever we're doing, providing more practical applications, because at the end of the day, economics is meant to be sort of applied to the real world. And yeah, so we've been doing that sort of work alongside other sort of societies in the network. And overall, it's been pretty successful. So
Interesting. So how did you get into it? How did you join Durham Society?
yeah, so the actual process in itself of joining was, really painless and easy. It was just as much, as easy as expressing my interest, and everybody there was very open-minded and welcoming, and I ended up becoming the secretary, just out of expression of my interest alone. Before I even joined, I was really, really interested in heterodox schools of economics, but we don't really have as many opportunities in Durham to pursue those things. We do have post-Keynesian and heterodox modules that aren't being offered or have never even been offered. And so I was sort of trying to find an outlet to talk to people about that, to promote it. I'd previously done work for different societies that are involved in sort of the Marxist school of thinking. So I sort of wanted to branch out from there and get involved in other things, and also just expand my own understanding. After all, I'm still an undergraduate, so I have a lot to learn. But yeah, I got involved, and everybody there was really welcoming, and yeah, I generally find that people who are quite open-minded about academic subjects, they're also very open-minded to other people. So everybody we became friends pretty quickly, and yeah, it's just been good experience overall so far.
Interesting. So when you look at what do you mean by the heterodox courses that are there but not offered?
Yeah, so we used to have a post-Keynesian economics module that was led by the coordinator for my degree, who is a specialist in post-Keynesian economics. But because of the low demand in the module, it has been postponed. So I think it was only offered maybe for 1 year. And obviously, that's one of the things that we look at as a society is, why is there such low demand for the module? Are people even aware that this school of thought exists? Is the low demand of the module caused because people genuinely don't want to take the module, or they just don't know that it exists? We found that in a lot of cases, people are just not knowledgeable of the extent of the education that they could be getting at the university. So unfortunately, that's something that exists, but we've been sort of working on outreach and, trying to get people to, sort of see the other perspectives and know what their programs can offer. And we also have a heterodox module, but I don't think it's ever been offered, which is also very unfortunate. It's on the program. You could see that we have a heterodox module. It's just never actually been formally taught by anybody. Which I think is also sort of tragic. It's meant to be a third-year module. A lot of people, they sort of counter that concept with, oh, if you're an undergraduate, you should be learning the mainstream, and maybe when you get to master's and PhD, that's when you should branch out to heterodox thinking. But I think when you're a third year, you can sort of formulate your own opinions in that sense. But I think that's a module that we should be offering, but unfortunately we don't. But that's definitely a goal that we're working towards.
That is fascinating. You have a module that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Yep.
So how do you go about teaching students that there's heterodox other schools of thought when they don't even know that exists? Like, how do you go about that?
Yeah, so generally speaking, it's about reaching out to students as they enter university. I think that a lot of students come to study subjects like economics, having a sort of basis in economics, but again, not having the biggest perspective on it. Like I mentioned, even I, as a high schooler, I was interested in economics, but I had no idea that so many different schools of thought existed. And so going into university, if you're still in that position, you're not going to be looking for different modules in heterodox economic thinking. You're not going to be looking at post-Keynesian economics, etc. And so if you're not actively searching for it, if the university is not actively advertising it, then the two sort of never come together and nobody ends up demanding it. I really think it's just about basic student outreach. I think every single sort of introductory economics lecture should start out with the lecturer sort of having a list of the various modules that they get and sort of warning them about the various trajectories that you could take. It's actually pretty interesting to sort of look at a bachelor's degree and realize how much of what you end up taking in third year is dependent on what you end up looking at in first year. And it's sort of scary because as a first year, undergrad, you're sort of going into there and you're picking modules that generally interest you. You never imagined that it would be determining the trajectory of your education come third year, but it really does. So I think it's incredibly important as soon as students get a foot into the door of the university to expose them to all of these things and say directly to their faces, hey, we have a heterodox module, we have a post-Keynesian module. We're also considering building a Marxian economics module, a feminist economics module. If this sounds interesting to you, please actively demand it, because without the student demand, it wouldn't exist, unfortunately. But yeah, it's really just as simple as communicating with the students. There's a lot of missing communication, I think, in economics departments, or maybe just even just departments in general. So I think that just be cultivated. That's it, really.
So you learned about a lot of schools of thought then so far, I think. What is the school of thought that really had an impact on how you look at economics or at the world?
Yeah, for me, I think throughout this talk, it's become pretty obvious that I lean more towards a sort of Marxian-structuralist perspective when it comes to social sciences. I think any sort of critical approach is really attractive to me, because I think that economics, this might be a bit of a hot take, but I think economics should be a normative as well as an analytical approach to social sciences. So I personally am heavily involved in Marxian economics, Marxian philosophy, and politics. The reason why I like it so much is because Karl Marx has such a vivid, rigorous philosophical sort of network and basis for everything that he writes. It has a metaphysical philosophy underlying it. It has an epistemological substratum. It, as a result, has normative stances that it takes philosophically, and all of that contributes to the various economic analyses that are taken by Karl Marx. I think that economics should be, in certain spheres, approached normatively, and for that you need to have a basis in philosophy and, as a result, in politics. I've heard professors say, even heterodox professors say, oh, economics should be solely an analytical sort of academic subject. Our job is only to go into industry and analyze the economy and tell people what the situation is so that they can make informed decisions. And, that people say that, politicians and people who study politics are the ones who should be making these sort of value judgments. But I think that's sort of a fundamentally wrong perspective, in my opinion. It could be because I'm just a heavily opinionated person to begin with. But I think that normative economics is something that everybody should approach at least once. And for that, you need to have a philosophical basis, a metaphysical one, an ethical one. That'll eventually result in some sort of political sort of network in your study. And yeah, that's part of the reason why I took the degree that I'm taking. I think it should be something that everybody should look into. But yeah.
Wow, okay. So to people who don't know, how would you explain Marxism? What did you say, Marxism-structuralist?
Yeah. So the basis of social sciences, one of the main debates that takes place in the subject is the, for example, structure agency debate. And so the structure agency debate asks the question, to what extent do humans and sort of institutions in society determine their own actions? And so Marx was heavily structuralist in his perspectives. So he was on one end of the spectrum where he basically said that humans, to a certain extent, don't have free will at all. A lot of what they do is heavily dependent on the structures that they're embedded in socially. He took a general materialist perspective when it comes to his metaphysical philosophy. So he really believed that the environment, the physical environment that you find yourself in, heavily influences how you act, how you think, how you feel, and eventually is slightly deterministic in the sense of how history develops through human action. And then you have on the other side people who are much more beholden to the idea of individual agency. So a lot of people think that a lot of more liberal perspectives tend to think philosophically that humans are inherently atomistic and individualistic, and they're driven by their own self-interest, and eventually in economics by the profit motive and all of these things. And so that sort of metaphysical perspective on the human is eventually translated to economic theory, because economic theory, especially in the mainstream, is based on certain presuppositions about human nature, and those at the end of the day, those are philosophical questions. And so I'm personally drawn to the same sort of end of the spectrum as Marx. I think that taking a very narrow perspective on humans as individuals is not only, I think, negligent, but also potentially harmful for society, because we do know that there are structures in our society which determine our lives and the way that we act. And those pose very serious ethical questions as well. And so I think approaching economics from that perspective is incredibly vital. At the end of the day, economics is a social institution, and we should be looking at it as such. I don't think it's just a collection of atomistic individuals. I think it's individuals that are embedded within a superstructure. So that's my preferred mode of analysis.
Okay, that's so interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
So also you talk about ethics in economics. How did you learn about ethics in economics? Did you have a course on that? Did you think about it? How?
Right. So just as a PP student, I had to take quite a few modules in philosophy, one of them being ethics and values. And so we learned about the sort of classical strands in ethical philosophy, as well as eventually practical applications. And those spanned everything from animal rights to ecological philosophy to religious philosophy. And even though they didn't explicitly have any sort of economical application, it's so obvious to me how they are able to apply to economics, because the economy, like I said, is a man-made institution, but it determines so much in our lives. I honestly could not imagine how we could approach economics without a normative perspective, because it is something that is so impactful on the world, and it has such large consequences for our well-being that I don't think we can afford to not look at it ethically. And so a lot of what we did was talking about what sort of constitutes right action and correct outcome, and what we see as beneficial in the world. I think that's something that is implicit in economics, even though we don't really talk about it. And I find that that's sort of very deficient, because if you look at mainstream economic theories and approaches, they have ethical positions embedded in them. You just don't learn that they're necessarily ethical philosophical positions. You sort of learn them within a larger background of economics. And so you learn about free market perspectives, but you don't realize that a free market perspective has underlying value judgments in them. And so a lot of people, they end up finishing an economics degree and they go out thinking, okay, now I'm equipped to make, objective economic decisions, but they don't realize that they're actually taking implicitly an ethical stance in doing so. And so when you're an economist, you really need to expose yourself to different ethical philosophy, because then you realize, oh, it's possible to construct a completely different school of economic thought if you value totally different things. So if you don't necessarily value the profit motive, and you value, I don't know, providing public goods to people, instead, then your sort of economic approach is going to be totally different, even though at the end of the day, we are trying to be as scientific and empirical as possible. So, yeah, incredibly important in my opinion. Obviously, especially in the context of my opinion that it's also heavily normative, but yeah, incredibly important. Everybody should study ethical philosophy and realize the connections that it has to economic theory.
So you learn to question the assumptions that we just take for granted actually in economics.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, every single theory that we learn in economics has metaphysical and ethical presuppositions. And a lot of people who aren't philosophically inclined, they, I think, don't learn that. And so they go out into the world, like I said, making decisions based on potentially presupposition that they don't even agree with. Oftentimes, you might take an economics student who is trying to receive one outcome economically using a method that values totally different things. So you might have a left-leaning person who heavily values, for example, free healthcare or a universal healthcare plan. They might value universal higher education. They might value the, I don't know, the meeting of people's needs as opposed to creating a sort of economic structure that allows for the distribution of products based on willingness to pay. And so you might have these sort of innate ethical beliefs, but you might still be using mainstream or sort of orthodox approaches that are trying to achieve completely different goals, and you just don't know about it. And I think that at the end of the day, any sort of analysis has to boil down to those things. Yeah.
Wow. So a little side question. You said ecological philosophy. What is that?
Yeah, so it's actually incredibly interesting. I wrote one of my term papers on ecological philosophy, interestingly enough. So environmental philosophy, and in it, ecological philosophy, is a general approach to asking philosophical questions that pertain to the natural world and what we value, aesthetically, in the natural world. So it generally asks questions of, should we value entire ecological systems over natural individuals? Is it possible to even attribute value to a system over, an individual within the natural world? And ask questions as to, for example, are we morally justified in sacrificing an entire sort of group within nature in order to save an entire natural system? For example, one of the papers that I wrote, if I recall correctly, is asking the question of whether it's morally justifiable to sort of eliminate or eradicate an invasive species in order to save the larger ecosystem. And, I took my personal position on that, and there are plenty of philosophers who take different positions on it. And I think that is something that eventually ends up filtering into ecological economics, because the whole point of that sphere of economics is that you're questioning what you value economically in terms of the natural world. Obviously, given today's situation with climate change and global warming, a lot of people, funnily enough, they're starting to realize, hey, maybe the fact that our economy is driven towards the profit motive and towards consumption of natural resources for production, maybe that's not the most beneficial thing for our lives in the long term. And so a lot of people are saying, well, if we want to build that sort of economy, what sort of theories or what sort of perspectives or frameworks do we even need to be looking at that? And ecological economics seems to be one step towards solving that question. It fundamentally asks, what do we value? In ecological economics, it happens to be ecological systems in the natural environment. And then it's about sort of taking a normative economic perspective on that and saying, okay, so what would an economy that values these things be structured as? How could we critique our current economy in those terms? And so, like I said, ethically, all these philosophical questions end up applying to our economics in the long term.
Okay, wow. Okay, so little shift. So with every guest, we do a little lightning round.
Sure.
So I ask a question and just say the first thing that comes up, okay?
Sure.
What is a skill any economist should learn?
I would say mathematics should be incredibly important, because at this point in time, economics is such a mathematical discipline. When we're talking about analysis, economic analysis, everybody should have some knowledge of mathematics. But again, I'm going to reiterate my personal bias towards philosophy, also the philosophy of economics. Every economist should familiarize themselves with metaphysical philosophy and with ethical philosophy. And they should use that specifically to look at the presuppositions of their economic theories philosophically, and think about whether you agree with them and how you would critique all of those positions.
Who do you admire or look up to in economics?
Who do I admire? Well, historically, I would say, like I mentioned, Karl Marx, amazing economist, amazing philosopher, and just political theorist in general. There are a lot of modern philosophers that modern economists that I look up to. James Galbraith is one. He is a professor at the University of Texas, and he specifically does work in the economics of inequality, and I find that really interesting. Also, Professor Richard Wolff, who right now is retired, but he is a economist from a critical perspective at the New School, and he does really interesting work educating people in critical perspectives. So that's really interesting to me.
What is the question you want me to ask you that I haven't asked you yet?
Oh boy. I would say, where would I hope to see the economy in the long run? I think would be a good question. Because I sort of been droning on and on about the importance of normative perspectives in economics, but I haven't really talked about where I personally would want to see the economy. I think from my perspective, a lot of capital that we have in the economy is socially produced. I think that we need to reevaluate our conceptions of private property and the way that that factors into our economic system. I think that in the long term, in order to mitigate massive economic inequalities, in order to slow climate change or impact on climate change, and in order to create a society that's more sort of ideologically and politically stable, in order to have a stable civil society, we need to reevaluate our perspective on that and allow for sort of more social perspectives on capital formation.
So how would you start going about that? Where would you start if you wanted to achieve something like that?
Yeah, great question. I would say that we need to start looking at the way that we structure the firm and the way that the firm structure sort of implicitly assumes different things about how they relate to people. I think that our firm structures are heavily undemocratic. I'm just going to say it frankly, in comparison to the sort of political systems that we want to have. A lot of us, in, at least in the Western world, we highly value democracy in our political system. We really couldn't imagine it any other way. If anybody was to even propose authoritarianism nowadays, it would generally just be rejected right off the bat. But for some reason, we look at our firm structures and our sort of microeconomic systems, and we don't see a lot of democratic participation in them, and we sort of see that as okay. And I think that 100 or 200 years from now, we're going to look at that and see it as absolutely unacceptable, just as we see the monarchists from the 19th century as absolutely unacceptable ideologically. So I think we need to look at the firm structure. The firm structure is based on a certain perspective on private property, namely that productive property belongs to a certain person despite it being contributed to by workers and other people. And so if we question that, if we question the way that we structure firms, we can start to reimagine the way that other people can work in firms, contribute to the operation of firms, eventually contribute and relate to the production of capital. And I think that'll eventually lead to a lot of interesting questions in public policy, the way that we have resource distribution in our society. I think we could potentially construct a society that is adaptive to the changes in our just sort of day-to-day lives. And I don't just mean changing markets, I mean systems that can change in their own presuppositions in themselves. Honestly, in the future, I hope to develop economic theory that leads to the outlining of a system that changes in its presuppositions depending on what the sort of priorities of the society are.
Okay. So would you say that there is a difference when it comes to looking at a firm with public and private organizations right now? That some are more towards what you want than private firms, or is it all very similar?
Yeah, I think that if we look at firms that are cooperatively operated, you'll find that a lot of them are more productive relatively to firms that are of the same mass and of the same level of employment. You'll find that a lot of individuals who participate in those firms have greater mental health. You'll find that they're more economically stable as financial actors. You'll find just so many improvements in terms of the individual well-being of those people, in terms of the firm's well-being. And at the same time, you're still preserving so many useful things. So you're not eliminating the free market, right? You're not eliminating all of these things that have helped our society progress. So you're keeping so many vital institutions like the free market and the way that the government interacts with that. But at the same time, you're giving people more control over their own lives. And I think that is something that we really need. And for example, the US with its firms, a lot of people feel alienated from their own work. I think a lot of people feel disempowered when it comes to their sort of economic lives as opposed to their political lives. And that could be a potential solution.
Okay, so where can people find the things that you're more enthusiastic about? Like, where can people find documents, people to listen to or read about?
Sure. So if you're interested in what I just mentioned in terms of the operation of cooperative firms, the ideas behind different types of capital formation. I would say look into the person that I mentioned beforehand, Professor Richard Wolff. He does a lot of work educating people on the basics of cooperative economics, which is a field in itself. And that's a really good way to start if you've never looked into that sort of thing. There are also quite a few figureheads who have been talking about alternative economic structures. A lot of professors, specifically from the New School University in New York City, do various types of scientific work pertaining to that. So if you look into their sort of published work, that could be very interesting for anybody that's involved in that sort of thing.
So what is the next topic you're diving into?
The next topic that I'm diving into, I would say that, well, currently I'm very interested in, obviously, in the sort of looking at primary texts in economics, trying to analyze more deeply the different philosophical backings and ethical presuppositions and underlying sort of principles that go into our economic systems. And I want to look at more normative work, work that's being done in terms of firm structure, in terms of approaches to the localization of globalization, things like that. I think those are really interesting topics, and all very interdisciplinary, but very relevant to the current world.
Okay, so final question. What is your advice to future economists?
My advice to future economists, well, John Maynard Keynes very famously advocated that the master economist has to be both a historian and a mathematician and a philosopher and a statesman and all of these various things. And I totally agree with him. I think that if you are an economist, if you want to be a well-rounded, a very professional, serious economist that eventually does beneficial work to society, you should look into philosophy, you should look into politics, you should attempt to sort of broaden your perspective on the social sciences, because at the end of the day, they're all analyzing more or less the same thing, but from different perspectives, and just try to be as informed of a social scientist as you possibly can.
Wow, thank you so much, Peter, for educating me, educating everybody who listens to this, because this was great. Thank you. Have a great evening.